Welcome, everybody, to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. Dr. Fine was on earlier today. A new record of coronavirus cases here in the state of Rhode Island, 936. When you use the catch-up numbers, we're at nearly 1,000 new cases. That's 2.5 times our highest day there in the springtime. So very much concerns about the spread of this. The governor just concluded her speaking portion of her weekly press event and outlined no new restrictions. I think shocking many and making much concern about what the implications are for the long term of hospital capacity, as well as what the implications are for a much longer and more serious potential lockdown in a week or two that could last a significant period of time. Let's go to the University of Virginia's Jennifer Lawless, chair of the Political Science Department, and get the latest update from Washington, D.C. Professor Lawless, thanks so much for joining us.
Happy to.
Okay, you're at the eye of the storm. You know all these Biden people. You're texting with them all the time. Is he, in fact, the president-elect?
I think according to everybody except Donald Trump and people in the Senate who are petrified by the possibility that Trump could still hurt them electorally. He is the president-elect. He's behaving like the president-elect, but unfortunately, he's doing it with one arm tied behind his back because although he has connections and familiarity with Washington and the White House and the federal bureaucracy, there are certain things that the outgoing administration is vital for. Connecting him with other heads of state. I mean, he's heard from several, but my understanding is that they've contacted him directly because they had that contact information. You know, it's not going through the State Department the way that it needs to go. Given the COVID cases nationally, the fact that he's basically running a shadow task force with no overlap with this administration is stunning as well. And so, you know, yes, he's the president-elect and he's doing the best he possibly can, and he's certainly conveying an air of calm. But at some point, it becomes too difficult to operate this way during the transition.
Is this getting a little overly dramatic? Let me just pose a little substance to this. The race got called on Saturday. It's 5 days later. Joe Biden's been in Washington for 47 years. I mean, he's been a United States Senator, Vice President of the United States for 47 years. In one role or another, except for 4 years out. I think he can get things started just fine.
Oh, there's no question that he can get things started. And the team has made it clear that up until this point, it has not been a hurdle. But as we get closer to Election Day, and as the virus continues to skyrocket and become even more and more uncontrollable, it's just an unfortunate set of circumstances, not to mention the fact that there are potentials for national security and intelligence risks simply because this administration is unwilling to work with the transition. So, you know, this is not to say that he's going to be weakened or impotent when he starts on day one, but it is to say that the Trump administration is making his life a lot more difficult. To demonstrate how much that's the case, we're beginning to hear Republican senators, not those who have even congratulated Joe Biden, but people like Oklahoma Senator Langford, who said that if the administration is not willing to start working with the Biden transition team by the end of this week, he's going to intervene. And so, you know, this is just not the way democracy works. This is not the way transitions are supposed to work. And it highlights how so much of what happens in U.S. politics is governed by norms, not laws.
Are we at any point surprised that Donald Trump is not being a gracious loser? I mean, listen, by all math, he's lost the race. Joe Biden is the president-elect. There's no two ways about it. There's no reversal of fortune. There's no widespread corruption in states across the country. None of those things happen. So are we surprised that the president's behaving this way based on his behavior over the last 4 years in office or in his previous business practices?
Well, I've got to hand it to Donald Trump because every time I think he can get no worse, he does. So, I mean, I'm somewhat surprised just because the state of democracy is on the line right now. A peaceful transition of power, the things that we just always held as givens, which will likely still happen, are just being treated as though they're, you know, optional. And I did not think that he would be a gracious loser, but I did think that he would walk away with his tail between his legs, take a couple of weeks to, bash everybody, and then, resurrect himself as something else. I didn't expect this. I also did not expect the Senate to be as silent as it's been. I mean, 4 Republican senators congratulating and recognizing Joe Biden is appalling.
Do we think that if you take off Donald Trump's T-shirt, there is a "democracy is #1" tattoo on his back? That has not ever been a thought in my mind.
I agree with you. My mind agrees with you, but just the fibers of my being suggested that at some point he was going to acknowledge that he lost. I mean, if you read these accounts and if you listen to the people inside the transition team and the and the Trump administration, what they're basically saying is that he will never concede. He will walk away. The message will be that the election was stolen from him, and he'll either launch a 2024 campaign immediately or he'll do something else. But it's just unfortunate that he's going to wait until the very last minute to actually make that move. It just makes everybody's life a lot more complicated. But I guess that's not surprising. That is how Donald Trump has governed for the last 4 years.
Let's talk about the coronavirus for a second here. Listen, there has not been federal leadership. The federal strategy has been to leave it to the states. The country is now besieged by the number of new cases, 140,000 new coronavirus. It was just, I want to say, 2 to 2.5 weeks ago, we were running around 40 to 50,000 on a daily basis. So we are seeing such a significant increase in the amount of new cases, and much, I think, earlier than anticipated. We thought this would be a December type of number, maybe even a January type of number. We're now racing for, God, we used to think January, and when these numbers started to go up, we'd hit 200,000 new cases on a daily basis. We could be there literally by the end of this month. Right. It is devastating, but there's not, Governor Raimondo just finished her press conference here. There's not a lot of strong leadership at the state level either. Other than Utah, that's the only state that's implementing a lockdown. All these governors, Democrats and Republicans, are trying to have their cake and eat it too by saying, oh, we're just going to stay open, or we're going to be strategic enclosures, while the cases across the country are running rampant in every region of the country. I get that Washington's not leading. When are the governors going to start leading?
I think it depends on who the governors are and what the case level is in the state. And unfortunately, it gets to the point where it's out of control before governors take action. Now, I would say that Andrew Cuomo is an exception to this. There have been little pockets and hotspots in and around New York. And he, with local elected officials in those areas, has been closing particular parts of cities and towns, particular parts of counties, and then reopening those areas, or at least releasing certain restrictions as the positivity rate goes down. So, for example, I'm in Orange County, New York right now. We were recently moved from orange to yellow. The students still can't go back to school at this point. There are other counties where there's virtually no virus and students are in a hybrid learning model. That works when you've got a large state and when you actually have relative stability in terms of where people are and where they work in and around that state. It doesn't work in a place like Rhode Island. It doesn't work in a place like Delaware or Vermont or New Hampshire, or any of these small states. And so, I think that that's the challenge. If there was federal leadership right now, I think that the federal government could, in some ways, say, look, we're going to bear the brunt. We're going to ensure that there's money so that we can have what amounts to a shutdown. And that's basically what it's going to take. Now, the Biden administration can make promises and they can talk about what is necessary and how they plan to lead. But until January 20th, they have no authority to implement any of that. So you can bet that Joe Biden is talking to governors, he's talking to mayors, he's discussing what kind of packages would be required. But by the time he's able to implement that and say that, look, don't blame your states, the federal government's going to bear the brunt of the punishment for this, but we're also going to get this out under control, it may be too late. The other thing that I would point to is that Donald Trump and a lot of these Republican governors have been touting a decline in the death rate. That's in part because the hospital infrastructure hasn't been at capacity and they've been able to treat people. That death rate is going to start going way up when we've got people on gurneys in the middle of the street again. And that's what's going to happen in states across this country.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had this discussion on GoLocal Live. Listen, we're better from a science standpoint not to slap a ventilator on everyone as we did at the beginning of this pandemic, but the quality of care is going to diminish when hospitals get overrun. And according to Governor Raimondo, that may take place in just days here in the state of Rhode Island that will reach capacity and be launching field hospitals. So that's not a December date, that's not a January or February or March date, that's a November date.
And what's going to make all of that worse is Thanksgiving and the holidays. I mean, we're at a point right now where people have basically decided that they're tired of this. And we were only at what, 50% mask compliance in the first place, 50% social distancing in the first place. Now we're being told that you should have your own sort of virtual Thanksgiving. Well, you know who's going to do that? The 50% of people who have been wearing masks and social distancing. Everybody else is not, and the governments are not cracking down in a lot of cases. And so, you know, it's petrifying. Schools like UVA, I don't know what Brown has decided to do. You know, the last week of classes for students is next week. They'll all go home. We're not starting again until February. It will be almost entirely online again, but at least that creates a 2-month lag, so maybe we can get things under control. But even a February 1 start, the Biden administration doesn't take office until, you know, 10 days prior to that. And Donald Trump has demonstrated no interest whatsoever in the last week of addressing this virus.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Biden taking over. Listen, wildly experienced team. He's wildly experienced. But I was talking to a former Obama person who was talking about how difficult it's going to be to start this administration up, even with all the experience it has. Just onboarding new employees and appointees. Most of the federal offices are closed. Most of the people who in many cases, who will come on board, who worked on the campaign, young people who will take strategic roles, maybe not top tier roles, but second tier roles, won't be going to an office to be onboarded. They won't develop any relationships with civil servants who are critical to the management of those agencies. This is going to be a much more complicated unveiling of a new administration than ever before.
I think that's right. And I think that's also why the American people should have some expectations of more experienced people coming in. So we might be seeing a lot of people who held previous positions or worked with Joe Biden, whether it be in the Senate or as vice president, coming in. That doesn't mean that they're going to be what the administration looks like for 4 years, but early on, until the virus is under control, until Washington sort of gets back to normal, until people can work in their actual offices and still comply with CDC guidelines, I wouldn't be surprised if we have a top layer of government that is probably more experienced and somewhat older than we're accustomed to when a new administration takes over. And I think that's merely, an artifact of who doesn't need to deal with a learning curve, right? Who can come in and hit the, work on day one. And that's not just Joe Biden. It's not just Ron Klain. It's got to be basically all of the top people for the top several layers of all of these agencies.
Yeah, let's talk about that. We talked a little bit before we came on about, is this de facto Obama 3.0? And I raise that question because, you look to these initial appointments and there have been few announcements, but the two co-chairs of the coronavirus task force are both former Obama top tier scientists, and Joe Biden naming his chief of staff, at least during the transition period, is a wildly experienced former staffer of his and other leading Democrats. Are we going to see a significant portion of former Obama people playing very significant roles in this Biden administration?
I think early on, certainly, but it's not, from my perspective, merely because Joe Biden wants to have Obama 3.0. It's an artifact of the current political environment and who has experience. Keep in mind, too, that the Obama administration is only 4 years ago. So it's not like we're hearkening back and hiring, Rob Reich and Donna Shalala to come in and run, our agencies at this point. This is not that long ago. These are people who have many of the connections that they still have in Washington.
Will Hillary Clinton be Secretary of State?
I think not. I think not. But, the other thing to keep in mind about why some of these appointments are important, too, is that the Senate is going to make Joe Biden's life difficult. And it's important that where he can make key appointments that don't require Senate approval, that he has the people that he needs and that he wants around him, so that a lot of the major decision making is not ultimately handled by Mitch McConnell and Republican Senate. That's also why these two Georgia races are so important right now.
We'll go to the Georgia races. Let's talk about Senate races and House races. Here was a major disappointment for the Democratic Party. Lost seats in the House. Was it a monumental swing? Was this a Newt Gingrich type of year? No. But to lose those number of seats in a year in which Democratic president won, and the amount of money spent on these congressional races, and in the Senate, to not recapture the Senate on, at least yet. It may happen in January. I mean, in South Carolina and North Carolina alone, it was over $150 million the Democrats spent on those two races. What went wrong for the Democrats in these congressional races?
A couple things. First, defund the police was a losing message from day one. And this is not about infighting within the Democratic Party, because the progressives don't actually want to defund the police either. They want to move funding and ensure that there's adequate community policing and that those agencies work with the police. But the minute you get those words, defund the police, you're losing races. There were Democrats in seats that they had no business having that were swept in 2018. And preserving those seats meant ensuring that the people in those districts felt comfortable, not only with what these incumbents had done for the last 2 years, but what they would do moving forward. And we're hearing it from people like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia and Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania. They were able to hold on. Lauren Underwood in Illinois, they were able to hold on, but by the skin of their teeth, and they had to fight back allegations, not of socialism. I think most voters didn't buy that. It hurt in 2 races in Florida. More broadly, I don't think that was the issue. This police messaging worked. The other thing that I would note is that, as far as the defunding the police messaging is concerned, the Democrats, Joe Biden wasn't hurt by it because he was so vocal about saying he didn't agree with it. It's unclear to me how much freedom candidates down ballot had in differentiating themselves from the broader party's message.
Listen, we have 2 elected officials in the city of Providence, 2 members of the city council who have called for the defunding of the police. They've repeated it time and time again. They've repeated it since the murder rate went from 1 murder in the first 5 months in the city to 14 murders in 4 months, 14 additional murders in 4 months. And so I think that's certainly going to have an impact in 2 years potentially on how people get defined, but I can see how it would impact folks in that election. Did the Democrats just misspend money? I mean, David Sirota, we've had him on GoLocal Live, Bernie Sanders' former speechwriter who now has a very interesting progressive news site, says the Democrats blew $1 billion in Senate races. Mismanaged money, old school TV buys, and a failed strategy and failed results.
So I don't know, because it's very easy to, talk about what went wrong, but there were things that went right. John Hickenlooper knocked off incumbent Cory Gardner. Mark Kelly knocked off incumbent Martha McSally. Now, those were 2 states where Biden also won the election. So it might be that their messages were more consistent with the Biden campaign's messages. But tons and tons of money were spent in those 2 races. And I don't think anybody would say that that was mismanaged or misspent, because it got the Democrats, 2 additional seats. It's hard to know, and there will be, discussions and autopsies of what has gone on. I also think that we have to rethink polling. The Maine Senate race is a perfect example. I was stunned. I wasn't that surprised by North Carolina. I wasn't that surprised by Iowa. These were races where it was unlikely that a Democrat was going to win. It looked like we were more competitive than we actually were, where Democrats were more competitive than they actually are. But Maine, to me, was the stunning result.
I never bought that Sarah Gideon was going to win in that state. First of all, the sitting senator has a lot of relationships. It's a small state like Rhode Island. She knows absolutely everyone. She is spectacular on constituent services. And while in the Beltway, the vote on Kavanaugh may have been the biggest deal in the history of the world, in Aroostook County, Maine, it's not on the top 100 list. And it might be a hotbed issue in Portland, you know, where 175,000 people live in the DMA, but in Bangor, Waterville, Auburn, Lewiston, and up north, forget it.
So it's interesting. So that's not my take on why Susan Collins was able to hold on. I think that we can't separate her victory from the fact that Donald Trump was, you know, very, very focused on Maine's 2nd congressional district. And so the voters that he turned out in Maine's 2nd congressional district voted Republican. If Maine hadn't looked like it was competitive for an electoral vote, I'm not sure that the outcome would have been the same, because I don't know that the national attention would have been the same, and the, you know, mobilization of Republicans would have been the same. I will say that my sort of, you know, one way to think about what to make of all of this, especially if the Democrats want to control the Senate, again, has to do with Susan Collins. So, you know, if the Democrats win both Georgia Senate races, then Kamala Harris is the deciding vote across the board. But if they don't, if they win one, you know, there are two options. There's one way you can try to convince Susan Collins to, like Angus King, become an independent and caucus with the Democrats, or you can offer Susan Collins a cabinet position that she really wants and have Democratic Governor Janet Mills appoint a Democrat to that Senate seat. And we know Democrats can win in that state. So, you know, I think, again, all eyes nationally are going to be focused on Susan Collins. This time, though, she's not going to be defending her position. This time she can basically, you know, get whatever she wants.
Yeah, that's right. She may be the most important person in the United States Senate. And by the way, does Kamala Harris want to be in Washington, D.C. every single day, deciding every single vote? A nightmare scenario for the brand new vice president. She can't even go to foreign dictators' funerals at that stage.
Right. I'd also note that I do think that she has, unfortunately, she cracked a glass ceiling. She's made history. It's phenomenal, and it's getting virtually no attention because we're still stuck on Donald Trump and what this means for the transition. And so I kind of feel bad for her on that front too.
Okay, last issue. I think it's been totally missed. Listen, Joe Biden has gotten the most votes in the history of of races for the U.S. presidency, and Donald Trump has gotten the second most. You know, something that I don't think anybody anticipated, and certainly not the pollsters in Rhode Island. Donald Trump, it's unbelievable, got the same percentage of the vote that he did 4 years earlier, and got 16,000 more votes than he did 4 years ago in the state of Rhode Island. The Democrats should celebrate, but they also have to be mindful of what those numbers mean and what the potential impact means for how strong Republican senators are going to stand up to this administration, and how quickly the next presidential race is going to be upon us.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. So this is a situation where even if Joe Biden winds up with a 7 or an 8 million vote edge in the popular vote, which is probably where he'll be once everything is counted, you cannot, as a Democrat, look around and say, "Up, mandate, all is good, let's go to work." You've got 71 million Americans who supported Donald Trump. And if you look at the exit polls, many of them supported him despite the fact that he's Donald Trump. You know, so some of it was enthusiasm for Trump as a political figure, but a lot of it was enthusiasm for the policies that he represented and concerns about the Biden administration and the policies that they'll represent. I don't have much concern in terms of Biden himself or his cabinet or the people that he'll surround himself with in terms of figuring out an appropriate way to make those Trump voters feel like they're not just being stepped on and trampled. I'm less convinced that Congress has the infrastructure and the incentive to compromise in a way that makes people on either side of the aisle feel like this administration is going to be different. Now, executive orders are one way to do it, symbolic appointments in the cabinet, a genuine bipartisan cabinet in some of these, for some positions, which is what we've always seen in the past. Donald Trump just couldn't get Democrats to serve. It's unclear if he would have wanted to. But as far as Congress is concerned, we now have thinner, a razor thin margin in the House. And what looks to be internal party strife on the Democratic side. And, that's just going to make any kind of compromise and any kind of, attempt to bring the country together that much more difficult.
any chance that in the House, Pelosi will not be the Speaker, Steny Hoyer will not be the number 2? I mean, it is not exactly been a youth movement over in the House.
So that's true, except I don't think that now is the time for Democrats to shift leadership. It's true that some seats were lost, but when you think about who the most effective strategists and tacticians are in the House of Representatives, it's Pelosi and Hoyer. And if they have to work with Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell to actually try and get things done, this is another place where I don't think it's necessarily the best time to bring in new, fresh voices, right? The stakes are so high right now, and so many of these issues are already well underway, and solutions are close. It was Donald Trump holding up some of those solutions that I don't know how much starting over there will be. Now, you can bet that if Nancy Pelosi doesn't think she has the votes to win, she's not going to run. So when she says that she plans to run, she plans to be Speaker.
Professor Lawless, thank you so much for this whirlwind trip through Washington, D.C. and across the country. As always, incredibly informative. I want to thank you so much, and thank you for joining us on election night, which was 2 hours of nonstop experts and insights. So I greatly appreciate you taking the time. Please stay safe where you are in New York. For everybody else, stay tuned. Much more coming today. Lots of news. Kate Nagel's got a recap on the governor's press conference and a number of other developments that are happening here in Rhode Island today. Everyone, please stay safe, wear a mask, save a job, save a Rhode Island business. Thanks, everybody.